Let me tell you a secret, a story whispered behind gloved hands in the gaslit corridors of power. It is about a man whose reputation was his armor, and a woman whose boldness was her only shield. In a world that demands perfection, their only sin was a moment of forbidden truth, a touch that threatened to burn everything to the ground. Lord Alistair Finch moved through the Duchess of Blackwood's ballroom as if navigating a chessboard. Every nod, every carefully chosen word, was a strategic play in the great game of society, a game he was born to win. His name was a legacy, his future a map drawn by his father, the formidable Earl of Pembroke. Tonight, that map led toward Lady Beatrice, a woman of impeccable breeding and a fortune that could shore up the Finch family's political ambitions for a generation. Alistair danced with her, his movements precise, his smile a well-practiced mask of polite interest. He spoke of Parliament and the weather, his mind 1,000 miles away, trapped in the gilded cage of his own life. He felt the weight of 100 pairs of eyes on him, each one assessing his value, his compliance. It was a suffocating pressure, the air thick with perfume, ambition, and unspoken judgments. And then he saw her. Across the room, half hidden behind a marble column, was a woman who did not belong. She was not dressed in the pale silks and satins of the other debutantes, but in a gown the color of a midnight sky, a startling slash of defiance in a sea of conformity. Her dark hair was coiled in a simple, elegant knot, and she held no fan to hide behind, her gaze direct and unerringly intelligent. She was watching him, not with the coy deference he was accustomed to, but with an open, searching curiosity, as if she could see the cracks in his carefully constructed facade. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, a spark of illicit recognition that sent a jolt through him. It was a dangerous glance, a secret shared across a crowded room, and it was utterly intoxicating. He broke the contact first, turning back to Lady Beatrice, his heart hammering against his ribs with a strange, unfamiliar rhythm. But the image of the woman in the midnight gown was seared into his mind. For the rest of the evening, he was acutely aware of her presence. He felt her gaze on him as he made his rounds, his conversations with ministers and matriarchs feeling more hollow than ever. He learned her name in a hushed whisper from a gossiping acquaintance. Miss Eleanor Vance, an artist's daughter, invited on a whim of the Duchess, who had a penchant for collecting curiosities. She had no title, no fortune, no place in his world. She was an irrelevance, a brief, startling distraction. Yet he could not shake the feeling that he had been sleepwalking his entire life and had only just been woken up. The air in the ballroom grew thick, the polite chatter a meaningless drone. He needed to escape, to breathe air that wasn't heavy with the scent of expectation. Excusing himself, he slipped away from the crushing weight of his duty and stepped out onto the cool, shadowed flagstones of the terrace, hoping to find a moment of peace. He did not find peace. He found her. She was standing at the far end of the terrace, her back to him, her hands gripping the cold stone balustrade. The moonlight caught in her dark hair, and for a moment Alistair simply watched her, a silent observer in the shadows. He should have turned back, returned to the ballroom and the safety of his prescribed life, but his feet would not move. He felt an invisible cord pulling him forward, a reckless curiosity he hadn't felt since he was a boy. As he drew closer, he saw that her shoulders were trembling. He heard a choked sob, quickly stifled. He stopped, his presence a sudden intrusion. "Miss Vance?" he asked, his voice lower than he intended. She spun around, her eyes wide and luminous with unshed tears in the dim light. Her face, which had seemed so bold and confident in the ballroom, was now a mask of raw vulnerability. Before she could answer, a shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness near the French doors. Lord Marcus Thorne, a man whose reputation for predatory advances was whispered but never openly acknowledged, stepped into the moonlight. His lip was curled in a triumphant sneer. "There you are, Finch," he said, his voice slick with false camaraderie. "Just enjoying the view." His gaze lingered on Eleanor with an insolent possessiveness that made Alistair's hands clench into fists. "Miss Vance was feeling unwell," Alistair said, his voice cold as ice. He took a deliberate step forward, positioning himself slightly in front of her, a subtle but unmistakable shield. "I was escorting her back inside." Thorne's eyes narrowed, recognizing the challenge. He looked from Alistair's stony face to Eleanor's tear-streaked one, and seemed to make a calculated decision. Forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes, he gave a mocking little bow. "Of course. Another time, Miss Vance." He sauntered back into the ballroom, leaving a trail of menace in his wake. The silence that fell between them was thick and charged. Eleanor finally let out a shaky breath she seemed to have been holding. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He wouldn't." She faltered, wrapping her arms around herself. "It is no matter," Alistair said, his formal tone a defense against the sudden, unnerving intimacy of the moment. "You should not be out here alone." As she turned to go, her heel caught on an uneven flagstone. She cried out, stumbling forward, and he reacted without thinking. He reached out, his hands closing around her arms to steady her. She fell against him, her head resting for a fleeting second against his chest. He could feel the frantic beat of her heart, the warmth of her breath through the fine wool of his coat. It was a simple touch, an accident born of chivalry, but it felt like a brand. Every rule of propriety was shattered in that single stolen moment of contact. A gasp from the doorway broke the spell. A dowager, the notorious Lady Danbury, stood silhouetted against the light of the ballroom, her fan frozen midway to her face, her eyes wide with scandalized delight. They sprang apart, but it was too late. The damage was done. The next afternoon, as Alistair sat in his study contemplating the inevitable fallout, his butler announced a visitor. It was Miss Vance. She stood before his desk, no longer the vulnerable girl on the terrace, but a woman of pale, resolute fury. "Lord Finch," she began, her voice trembling but firm, "thanks to you and the viper you chased away, my reputation is in tatters. Lady Danbury's version of events is already the talk of the town." He stood, a cold knot of dread tightening in his stomach. "Miss Vance, I assure you, nothing improper occurred." "But it looked as if it did," she countered, her eyes flashing. "And in my world, appearance is everything. I am ruined. A fallen woman, thanks to a stumble and a lord's misplaced grasp." She took a deep breath, her gaze unwavering, and delivered the blow. "You touched me last night, my lord, in view of the most vicious gossip in London. Now you must marry me, or I'll be marked in shame for the rest of my days, a fate I will not accept in silence." The audacity of her demand left Alistair speechless. He stared at her, this woman he barely knew, who was now attempting to single-handedly dismantle his meticulously planned life. His first instinct was to refuse, to call her bluff. But as he looked at her, at the genuine desperation warring with defiance in her eyes, he saw the terrible truth of her position. For him, the whispers would be a temporary inconvenience, a minor stain on an otherwise immaculate reputation. For her, an artist's daughter with no powerful family to protect her, it was a social death sentence. He was a man of honor, a concept drilled into him since birth. And honor, his father had always said, was about accepting the consequences of one's actions, intended or not. His touch, however accidental, had placed her in this ruinous position. "Marriage is out of the question," he said, his voice strained. "It is an impossibility." He thought of his father, of Lady Beatrice, of the political alliances that rested on his union with her. A marriage to Miss Vance would be a catastrophe. "Then I will have no choice but to name you publicly," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, laced with a threat that was all the more potent for its quiet delivery. "I will tell everyone that Lord Finch, the paragon of virtue, took advantage of me on a darkened terrace. Perhaps I will even embellish the tale. Who do you think they will believe? The desperate girl with nothing to lose, or the lord who was seen holding her in his arms? She was right. The scandal would be enormous. It wouldn't matter what the truth was. The mud, once thrown, would stick. He would be tainted, his family's name dragged through the mire. He paced the length of his study, the walls lined with the stoic, judgmental portraits of his ancestors, feeling the trap closing in around him. He was caught between honor and duty, between personal ruin and dynastic disaster. There had to be another way. A compromise. A bargain. He stopped in front of her, his mind racing, searching for a path through the wreckage. There will be no marriage, he repeated, his tone firm, leaving no room for argument. However, I will not see you ruined. He paused, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. I will agree to an engagement. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly. An engagement? A temporary one, he clarified, the plan forming as he spoke. We will announce our intention to marry. We will present a united front, attend the necessary social functions, and allow the gossip to die down, replaced by the news of our impending nuptials. After a suitable period of few months, perhaps we will have a quiet, mutual dissolution of the arrangement. I will claim a change of heart, and you will be free, your reputation restored, perhaps even enhanced by having been engaged to a Finch. I will provide you with a generous settlement to ensure your future security. It was a devil's bargain, a solution that was both brilliant and deceitful. It would save them both, but it would be built on a foundation of lies. And the terms of this performance? She asked, her voice wary. In public, we are the happy couple, devoted. In love, he said, the words feeling alien on his tongue. In private, we are strangers. We will maintain a strict professional distance. No unnecessary contact. No personal revelations. Is that understood? He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, disappointment, relief, but it was gone as quickly as it came. She gave a single, sharp nod. Understood, my lord. He extended a hand, not in warmth, but as if sealing a business contract. Then, Miss Vance, it seems we have an accord. She placed her hand in his. Her skin was cool, her grip surprisingly firm. The brief contact sent another unexpected jolt through him. This was madness. He was engaged to a woman he didn't know, bound to her by a scandal that wasn't real, all to protect a reputation he was beginning to despise. The announcement of their engagement sent a shockwave through the upper echelons of society. The Earl of Pembroke was apoplectic, his face a thunderous mask of rage as he confronted Alistair in the family's suffocatingly formal London drawing-room. An artist's daughter? A nobody? Have you lost your mind? He roared, his voice echoing off the high, coffered ceilings. You were to marry Lady Beatrice. This dalliance will be the ruin of us. Alistair stood his ground, his face a calm, unreadable mask he had perfected over years of paternal tirades. My mind is made up, father. I will marry Miss Vance. The lie felt heavy and cold, a stone in his gut. He could not, of course, reveal the true nature of their arrangement. The secret of the scandal was the very thing their public performance was meant to conceal. The facade began that very week. Their first official appearance as an engaged couple was a promenade in Hyde Park. Alistair called for Eleanor in his carriage, the silence between them thick with unspoken rules and resentments. He watched her as she stared out the window, her profile proud and beautiful against the blur of the city. She was an enigma, a woman who had blackmailed him into this charade, yet he could not bring himself to truly despise her. There was a core of strength in her that he found, to his own dismay, compelling. In the park, the performance began. He helped her from the carriage, his hand briefly touching hers, a gesture that felt both theatrical and intensely private. He offered her his arm, and she took it, her fingers resting lightly on his sleeve. They walked along the Serpentine, 100 pairs of eyes dissecting their every move. He pointed out the swans. She commented on the light filtering through the trees, their conversation a stilted public script. Yet, beneath the performance, a strange current flowed between them. When a stray dog bounded toward them, he instinctively moved to shield her, his arm tightening around hers. For a moment, her pretense of a gentle smile became something real, a fleeting glimpse of the woman beneath the mask. It was in these small, unscripted moments that the danger lay. The accidental brush of his hand against hers as he passed her a cup of tea at a garden party. The shared, exasperated glance across a dinner table when a boorish lord told a terrible joke. Each incident was a tiny crack in the armor of their arrangement, letting in a sliver of unexpected warmth. Lord Thorne was a constant, menacing presence at the edge of their carefully constructed world. He watched them with a hawk's intensity, his eyes filled with a possessive jealousy that made Alistair's skin crawl. He would corner Eleanor at balls, his questions about their courtship just a little too pointed, his compliments laced with a sneering disbelief. Alistair found himself becoming fiercely, irrationally protective of her. He would appear at her side, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back, a clear, silent warning to Thorne to back away. These public displays of ownership were part of the act, of course. He told himself that repeatedly. But the feeling they stirred in him, a primal territorial instinct, felt disturbingly real. One evening, after a particularly trying night at the opera, where Thorne had been relentless, they sat in the carriage on the way to her modest lodgings. The silence was heavier than usual. "He knows," Eleanor said suddenly, her voice low. "He doesn't believe it." Not for a moment. Alistair stared out at the gaslit streets, the shadows of the city flickering across his face. Let him think what he wants. In a few months, it will be over. Will it? She asked, and he could feel her gaze on him in the darkness. "Sometimes, my lord, I find this performance disconcertingly easy." Before he could formulate a reply, the carriage stopped. The ride was over. He escorted her to her door, the unspoken tension crackling between them. As she turned to go, her shawl slipped from her shoulder. He reached out to catch it, his fingers grazing the warm, bare skin of her arm. The contact was electric. They both froze, their eyes locking in the dim light of the doorway. The world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them, suspended in a moment of forbidden possibility. He could see the pulse beating in the hollow of her throat. He wanted, with a sudden, desperate urgency, to lean in and kiss her. The impulse was so strong, it was a physical ache. With a strength he didn't know he possessed, he pulled back, his hand dropping to his side. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet street. "Good night, Miss Vance." He turned and walked away without looking back, the cool night air doing nothing to quell the fire that had ignited within him. The invitation to dinner at Pembroke House felt less like a request and more like a summons. Alistair's parents, having failed to break the engagement through sheer force of will, had decided on a different tactic: scrutiny. They would dissect Miss Eleanor Vance over soup and sherry, searching for the fatal flaw that would prove their son had made a catastrophic error. Alistair warned her in the carriage on the way. "They will be challenging," he understated. "My mother will question your background, your education. My father will simply glower. And I will be charming," Eleanor replied, though he could see the nervous tension in the way she clasped her hands in her lap. "It's part of our arrangement, is it not? To be convincing." The evening was an ordeal. The Countess of Pembroke, a woman as cold and brittle as spun glass, subjected Eleanor to a relentless interrogation disguised as polite conversation. She inquired about Eleanor's late father, the artist, with a delicate sneer, and raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow at the news that Eleanor supported herself by selling her own paintings. "How novel," the Countess murmured, the word hanging in the air like an insult. Through it all, Eleanor was magnificent. She met every condescending question with a grace and wit that left the Countess momentarily speechless. She was poised, intelligent, and utterly unflappable. Alistair found himself watching her not as a co-conspirator in a grand deception, but with a burgeoning, genuine admiration. The turning point came during dessert. The Earl, who had remained largely silent, finally spoke, his voice a low rumble of disapproval. "Alistair has always understood his obligations," he said, his gaze fixed on his son, but his words clearly intended for Eleanor. "He has a duty to this family, to his name, a duty that will not be sidetracked by frivolous sentiment." It was a direct attack, a dismissal of their relationship as a meaningless infatuation. Before Alistair could form a retort, Eleanor spoke, her voice clear and steady in the suddenly silent dining room. "I assure you, my lord, I am as aware of Alistair's duties as you are," she said, her eyes meeting the Earl's without a flicker of intimidation. "In fact, it is his profound sense of honor that I first came to admire, a quality, I am sure, he inherited from his father." The Earl was so taken aback by the combined flattery and rebuke that he simply stared at her, speechless. The Countess's lips thinned into a line of pure fury. In that moment, Eleanor had not just defended their lie. She had defended him. Later, after they had made their escape, Alistair walked with her to the library, ostensibly to retrieve her wrap. The cavernous, book-lined room was quiet, the air thick with the scent of old leather and the unspoken tension from the evening. "You did not have to do that," he said, his voice quiet. "Defend me." "He was insulting you," she replied, turning to face him. The firelight cast flickering shadows across her face, making her eyes seem impossibly dark and deep. "I found I did not care for it." "It was a masterful performance," he said, the words feeling inadequate. "You were brilliant." "It wasn't a performance," she whispered, and the admission hung between them, a dangerous, fragile truth. The space between them seemed to shrink, to crackle with an energy that was both terrifying and irresistible. All the rules of their arrangement, all the carefully constructed walls they had built, crumbled to dust. He saw the lie of their engagement for what it was, a pathetic shield against this undeniable, overwhelming force that had been building between them from the very beginning. "Eleanor," he breathed, her name a prayer and a curse on his lips. He reached out, his hand cupping her jaw, his thumb stroking the soft skin of her cheek. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut for a heartbeat. This was the point of no return, the midpoint of their journey, where the lie ended and a far more dangerous truth began. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle, tentative kiss. It was a kiss of pent-up frustration and suffocating longing, a desperate, drowning kiss that spoke of stolen glances and forbidden thoughts. She kissed him back with an equal, startling passion, her hands coming up to tangle in his hair, pulling him closer. It was a confession, a surrender, a choice to risk everything for this one breathtaking moment of honesty. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, the world tilted on its axis. The bargain was broken, the sham was over, and in its place was something infinitely more real and infinitely more scandalous. The kiss changed everything. The carefully drawn line between public performance and private reality was irrevocably blurred. Their sham engagement, once a shield against scandal, now became the perfect cover for a secret, breathless affair. The world saw a proper, if slightly mismatched, couple going through the motions of courtship. But in the quiet moments, away from the prying eyes of society, a different story unfolded. They were no longer strangers bound by a contract. They were conspirators in a far more dangerous game, one of passion and secrecy. Their meetings were clandestine, fraught with the thrilling risk of discovery. A locked garden at dusk, where he would meet her by the old stone fountain, the scent of roses heavy in the air. A forgotten alcove in the British Museum, where they would pretend to study ancient artifacts, their shoulders brushing, their whispered conversation about history, a thin veil over the more urgent language of their eyes. In these stolen hours, the masks fell away. He was not Lord Finch, the heir to an earldom, and she was not Miss Vance, the social climber. They were just Alistair and Eleanor. He learned of her childhood in the countryside, of her fierce love for her father, who had encouraged her talent and taught her to be unafraid of a world that sought to put her in a box. She, in turn, discovered the man beneath the stiff, formal exterior. She saw his dry, wry humor, his deep-seated frustration with the gilded cage of his life, and the genuine kindness he tried so hard to conceal. Their intimacy was built in whispers and fleeting touches. A letter slipped into her hand as they passed in a crowded hallway, its contents a simple, searing line. "I am counting the seconds." The pressure of his knee against hers under a dinner table, a secret signal of shared desire that made her breath catch in her throat. The risk was a constant, exhilarating hum beneath the surface of their lives. A housemaid would enter a room without knocking, forcing them to spring apart, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. Alistair's valet, a man whose loyalty was to the Earl first and foremost, would give him a long, knowing look after he returned late at night, the scent of Eleanor's floral perfume clinging faintly to his coat. One afternoon, Alistair visited her small studio, a bright, cluttered room that smelled of turpentine and fresh paint. It was the heart of her world, a space more intimate than any bedroom. Canvases were stacked against the walls, her work vibrant and full of a life that London's formal drawing rooms lacked. He stood before a half-finished portrait, a study of a flower seller, her face etched with a beautiful, weary resilience. "You see people," he said quietly, a note of awe in his voice. "Not their titles or their fortunes. You see who they are." "It's all I've ever wanted to do," she replied, coming to stand beside him. "And what is it you want, Alistair? Truly?" The question hit him with the force of a physical blow. No one had ever asked him what he wanted. His wants had always been irrelevant, subsumed by the weight of his duty and his family's expectations. He looked at her, at the genuine curiosity in her eyes, and felt a profound, aching yearning for a life he had never allowed himself to imagine. "You," he said, the word a raw, unguarded admission. The space between them shimmered with the force of his confession. He reached for her, pulling her into an embrace, burying his face in her hair. This felt more real than any ballroom, any political meeting, any part of his public life. This was the truth. But as he held her, a floorboard creaked in the hallway outside her studio door. They froze, their bodies rigid. The sound of footsteps paused, lingered for a moment, and then moved on. They let out a shared, shaky breath. It was a stark reminder of their precarious reality. Their secret world was a fragile bubble, and outside, the sharp point of discovery was waiting, ready to tear it all apart. Lord Marcus Thorne was a man who fed on the secrets of others. He had watched the engagement of Lord Finch and the upstart artist's daughter with a growing, obsessive suspicion. It had all been too sudden, too convenient. The public displays of affection seemed just that, displays. Thorne, who had wanted Eleanor for himself with a brute, possessive desire, could not accept that she would choose the cold, restrained Finch over him. He began to watch them not as a rival, but as a hunter stalking his prey. He made it his business to know their schedules. He would appear at the same art galleries, the same charity breakfasts, his presence a constant, unsettling reminder of the threat of exposure. He started to notice the small things, the details that a casual observer might miss. The way Finch's eyes would follow Eleanor across a room, not with the placid contentment of a fiancé, but with a raw, desperate hunger. The fleeting, unguarded smiles they exchanged when they thought no one was looking. These were not the signs of a proper courtship. This was the behavior of people with a secret. Thorne began his campaign subtly, with poisoned whispers and carefully planted seeds of doubt. A rather passionate courtship, wouldn't you say? he would murmur to a gossip columnist over brandy. Almost theatrical. One wonders what brought it on so suddenly. He hired a private investigator, a grubby little man who skulked in the shadows, to follow them both. The man reported on Alistair's late-night visits to Eleanor's modest neighborhood, visits far too frequent and far too long for a respectable engagement. He noted their clandestine meeting in the museum, their hushed conversation in the park that seemed far more intimate than public propriety allowed. Armed with this information, Thorne grew bolder. He began to apply pressure, to test the cracks in their story. At a dinner party hosted by a mutual acquaintance, he cornered Alistair in the billiard room. "She is a remarkable woman, Miss Vance," Thorne began, circling the table, his movements slow and predatory, full of surprises. "You must tell me, Finch, what was it that so captivated you on the Duchess's terrace that night? It must have been quite a conversation to lead to a proposal so quickly." The implication was clear, the threat hanging in the air. Alistair's hand tightened on his billiard cue, his knuckles white. "My relationship with my fiancée is none of your concern, Thorne." "Oh, but I think it is," Thorne purred, leaning closer. "You see, when a man of your stature makes such an unconventional choice, it becomes everyone's concern. It makes people ask questions. And I, for one, am very curious about the answers." The pressure was not just coming from Thorne. The web of their deception was beginning to fray at the edges. Alistair found himself constantly lying, not just to his family and his peers, but to himself. He was forced to publicly defend the honor of a relationship that had been born of blackmail. He gave a speech at his club, praising Eleanor's virtue and intelligence, his words a strange mixture of public fiction and private truth. Each lie he told to protect their secret bound him more tightly to her, making their union seem more legitimate, more inescapable. He was trapped in his own gilded cage, but now Eleanor was trapped in there with him. One evening she came to him, her face pale with distress. A letter had arrived, an anonymous note written in crude block letters. It contained a single chilling sentence. "I know what happened on the terrace. It's him," she whispered, her hands trembling as she held out the piece of paper. "He's not going to stop." Alistair looked at the note, then at her terrified face. The game had changed. This was no longer just about suspicion. It was about extortion. Thorne was tightening the noose, and Alistair knew, with a cold certainty, that he would not rest until he saw them both destroyed. The anonymous note was just the beginning. The Whisper campaign, orchestrated by Thorne, took on a life of its own, spreading through the drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs of London like a fever. The narrative was simple and poisonous. The clever, penniless artist's daughter had entrapped the noble but naive Lord Finch, faking a compromising situation to force his hand. Every public appearance they made was now viewed through this new, cynical lens. The polite smiles of their peers seemed to hide sneers of contempt. Conversations would halt abruptly when they entered a room, only to resume in hushed, conspiratorial tones the moment they passed. The pressure was immense, a constant, suffocating weight. Alistair, who had spent his entire life commanding respect, was now the subject of pitying glances and veiled insults. His political allies, men who had once courted his favor, began to keep their distance. The proposed alliances that were to be built on his marriage to Lady Beatrice had evaporated, leaving his father's ambitions in tatters. The Earl's fury had cooled into a glacial, terrifying calm. He summoned Alistair to his study one morning, the room dark and cold, despite the fire in the hearth. He did not yell. His voice was quiet, precise, and utterly devoid of warmth. "This farce has gone on long enough," the Earl said, his hands steepled on his vast mahogany desk. "You will end this engagement. Today, I have arranged for the girl to be given a generous sum and passage to America. She will disappear, and in a year this entire sordid affair will be forgotten." Alistair stared at his father, a man he had both feared and revered his entire life. A year ago, he would have obeyed without question. But the thought of sending Eleanor away, of erasing her from his life as if she were a mere inconvenience, was unbearable. No, Alistair said, the single word costing him more than he could have imagined. I will not. The Earl's eyes, cold chips of blue ice, narrowed. Then you are no longer my son. You will be cut off, disinherited. You will leave this house, and you will not return. You will have your artist's daughter, but you will have nothing else. The ultimatum was absolute. He was being forced to choose between his entire world, his family, his fortune, his future, and the woman he loved. The choice was agonizing, but in his heart, he knew it was no choice at all. For Eleanor, the isolation was more direct, more brutal. The ladies of society, led by the scorned Lady Beatrice and the venomous Countess of Pembroke, turned their backs on her. Invitations ceased to arrive. When she attended a gallery opening, she was met with a wall of cold shoulders and cutting remarks, loud enough for her to overhear. Such a shame, her ambition got the better of her talent. They say she practically threw herself at him. She endured it with a quiet dignity that infuriated her tormentors, and filled Alistair with a fierce, protective rage. But he saw the toll it was taking. He saw the shadows under her eyes, the way her smile no longer quite reached them. They were being pushed to the brink, their world shrinking until it contained only each other. One rainy night, he went to her studio, seeking refuge from the storm, both outside and within. He found her standing by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. "Perhaps your father is right," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Perhaps I should go. It would solve everything." Alistair came to stand behind her, his hands resting on her shoulders. He could feel the tremors of her silent tears. "It would solve nothing," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Because the only thing that matters in any of this is you." He turned her around to face him, his hands framing her face. He saw not the schemer of the gossip columns, but the brave, brilliant woman who had challenged his world and captured his soul. "They want to tear us apart, Eleanor," he said, his voice low and intense. "They are pushing us into the shadows. Let them. Our world doesn't have to be their world." It was a vow, a declaration of defiance against the society that sought to crush them. They were pariahs, outcasts, but they were outcasts together. The forces aligned against them were powerful, but in their shared isolation, their bond was forged into something unbreakable, something worth fighting for, no matter the cost. The Duchess of Blackwood's annual masquerade ball was the glittering apex of the social season, a place of intrigue where masks concealed identities and secrets were currency. It was, Thorne decided, the perfect stage for his final devastating act. He had watched Alistair and Eleanor's defiance with a cold, simmering fury. Their refusal to break under the pressure of his whisper campaign had transformed his jealousy into a venomous obsession. He would not just separate them, he would humiliate them. He would expose their sordid secret in the most public way imaginable, ensuring they were so thoroughly ruined they would never recover. His plan was cruel in its simplicity. He knew from his hired informant of their secret meeting place, the grand conservatory, a vast glasshouse filled with exotic plants and secluded, shadowy corners. He had seen them there himself, a brief, stolen glance of two figures, so lost in each other they were oblivious to the world. He penned a note, carefully forging Alistair's elegant, sloping handwriting, a skill he had practiced with meticulous care. The note was simple. "My dearest E, meet me in the conservatory at midnight, the usual place. I have something to tell you. All my love, A." He arranged for the note to be delivered to Eleanor's lodgings by a messenger boy on the afternoon of the ball. He knew she would go, and he knew, with an instinct for his rival's character, that Alistair would somehow find out and follow her. Then, at the stroke of midnight, Thorne would lead a curated audience, the most influential, most judgmental members of the ton into the conservatory on the pretense of admiring a rare night-blooming orchid. He would be their guide to a far more scandalous bloom, the unmasking of the season's most notorious lovers. Alistair, meanwhile, was consumed by a growing sense of unease. He had not sent Eleanor a note. He hadn't spoken to her since the day before, and the thought of seeing her at the ball, of having to navigate the treacherous waters of their public facade while his heart ached for their private reality, filled him with a nervous dread. He arrived at the ball late, his own mask a simple black domino, doing little to conceal the tension in his jaw. The ballroom was a kaleidoscope of color and sound, but he scanned the crowd with a singular focus, searching for her. He found her near the orchestra, looking magnificent and utterly alone in a gown of deep crimson. Their eyes met, and a silent, urgent message passed between them. Something was wrong. Excusing himself from a dull conversation, he made his way to her side. "Did you get my note?" she whispered, her voice tight with a strange excitement. Alistair froze, a cold premonition washing over him. "What note?" Her face fell as he spoke, her excitement instantly replaced by dawning horror. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her reticule. He read the forged words, and the pieces of the trap clicked into place with sickening clarity. "Thorn," he breathed, his voice a low, vicious curse. "It's a trap. He wants to expose us." He looked at the grand clock at the end of the ballroom. It was 10 minutes to midnight. Where? He asked, his voice urgent. The conservatory. The bench by the fountain. He took her arm, his mind racing. They could leave, flee the ball, and the inevitable confrontation. But he knew, with a sudden, blazing certainty, that he was done running. He was done hiding in the shadows. He would not allow Thorn to write the ending to their story. "We go," he said, his voice ringing with a newfound resolve. "But we go together. And we will not be the ones who are unmasked tonight." They moved through the throngs of masked revelers, a silent, determined pair, cutting through the manufactured gaiety of the ball. Alistair's mind was a whirlwind of strategy. Every instinct he possessed as a political player now focused on this single personal battle. Thorn expected to find them in a secret, passionate embrace. He expected shame, denial, and ruin. Alistair would give him something else entirely. He would give him the truth, but on his own terms. They reached the ornate glass doors of the conservatory, just as the clock began to strike the first chime of midnight. Inside, the air was warm and humid, thick with the scent of damp earth and exotic blossoms. Moonlight streamed through the high glass ceiling, illuminating the lush foliage and casting long, eerie shadows. The sound of the fountain was a gentle splash in the otherwise silent space. They walked to the appointed bench, but they did not sit. They did not embrace. Instead, they stood side by side, facing the entrance, and waited. As the final chime of midnight faded, the doors to the conservatory swung open. Lord Thorn stood there, a triumphant, malicious smile playing on his lips. Behind him, as planned, was a small, influential crowd. Lady Danbury, a gossip monger. The Earl of Sutherland, a key political figure. And, to Alistair's shock, his own father, his face a grim, stony mask. "Well, well," Thorn said, his voice booming in the quiet space, dripping with mock surprise. "What have we here? A secret midnight tryst? I must say, Finch, I thought even you had better sense than to be caught in such a compromising position." He gestured for his audience to come closer, to witness the kill. They stepped inside, their masked faces turning from Thorn to the couple standing calmly by the fountain. "There is no tryst, Thorn," Alistair said, his voice clear and steady, devoid of the panic Thorn had anticipated. "I am simply showing my fiancée the night-blooming Sirius, a rare and beautiful flower, much like her." He reached out and took Eleanor's hand, his fingers lacing with hers. It was a simple gesture, but in this supercharged atmosphere, It was a profound declaration. It was not the furtive touch of a secret lover, but the confident, public gesture of a devoted partner. Thorne's smile faltered. This was not going according to his script. "Don't play games, Finch," he sneered. "We all know what this is. A sordid affair born of blackmail and desperation. You were seen on the terrace. She trapped you." A gasp went through the small crowd. It was the first time the accusation had been leveled so openly. This was the moment of truth, the point where Alistair must either deny everything and cast Eleanor aside, or commit to the lie and defy them all. He chose a third option. He looked not at Thorne, but directly at his father, at the other silent, judgmental faces. "You are mistaken," Alistair said, his voice resonating with an authority he had never before possessed. "There was no blackmail. There was only a man who was so captivated by a woman's beauty, intelligence, and spirit that he fell in love with her at first sight." He turned his gaze to Eleanor, and the world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them in the moonlit conservatory. The mask of the politician, the dutiful son, the constrained lord, fell away, and for the first time he spoke with complete, unvarnished honesty. "I love this woman," he declared, his voice ringing with passion and conviction. "I love her more than my title, more than my inheritance, more than my reputation. And it is my profound honor that she has agreed to be my wife." He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it, a gesture of such profound tenderness and defiance that it silenced the entire room. He had taken Thorne's trap and turned it into his stage. He had not denied the scandal. He had redefined it. He had chosen love over duty, passion over propriety, and in doing so had unmasked himself not as a fool, but as a man who was finally, unequivocally, free. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Alistair's defiant declaration in the conservatory did not win over the arbiters of society. It condemned him. It was one thing to have a discreet affair, but to publicly choose a woman of no standing over family, fortune, and duty was an unforgivable transgression. It was not romantic. It was an abdication. The story of the unmasking became the scandal of the decade. Alistair was branded a sentimental fool, a man led astray by a conniving siren. Eleanor was painted as the ambitious mastermind, the artist's daughter who had played the long game and lost, bringing ruin upon the very man she had sought to possess. The day after the ball, Alistair was formally disinherited. The meeting with his father was brief and glacial. The Earl did not raise his voice. He simply informed Alistair that his name had been struck from the family ledgers, his access to all funds was terminated, and he was to vacate Pembroke House by nightfall. The door to his old life had not just been closed, it had been barred and bolted. They left London under a shroud of disgrace. Their departure was a stark contrast to the glittering world they were leaving behind. There was no grand carriage, only a hired coach. No servants to pack their belongings, only what they could carry themselves. They were pariahs, their names whispered with a mixture of scorn and pity. Alistair had one remaining asset, a property his father could not touch, a small remote cottage on the Cornish coast, inherited from his maternal grandmother. It was a place he had not visited since he was a boy, a half-forgotten memory of sea cliffs and windswept moors. It was to this refuge that they fled. The cottage was a world away from the opulent townhouses of London. It was small, rustic, and battered by the constant sea wind. The paint was peeling, the garden was overgrown, and the rooms were filled with dusty, shrouded furniture. For Alistair, who had known nothing but unimaginable luxury, the place was a shock. For Eleanor, who had grown up with little, it was a sanctuary. In the silence of their new isolated world, the weight of their decision settled upon them. They had chosen each other, but the cost was staggering. Alistair felt the phantom limb of his old life, the absence of the power and purpose that had defined him. He would wake in the night, the Earl's cold, dismissive words echoing in his ears. He was no one now, a man without a name, without a future. Eleanor, too, wrestled with her own demons. She carried the heavy burden of guilt, believing she was the cause of his downfall. She had gambled for her reputation and had cost him everything. The first few weeks were a period of difficult adjustment. They were two strangers, stripped of their public personas, forced to confront the raw, unvarnished reality of who they were. The easy intimacy of their secret affair was gone, replaced by the awkward, challenging intimacy of a shared, uncertain life. They learned to live with less. They learned to chop their own wood, to cook their own meals, to tend the neglected garden. Alistair, the man who had debated policy in the House of Lords, found a surprising competence in repairing a leaky roof. Eleanor, the woman who had captivated ballrooms, found a quiet joy in painting the wild, dramatic coastline. Slowly, painfully, they began to navigate the wreckage of their old lives and build something new. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, the sound of the crashing waves a constant companion, and they would talk. They spoke not of what they had lost, but of what they had found. They reckoned with the choices they had made, the lies they had told, and the truth they had finally claimed as their own. In the quiet solitude of their Cornish exile, the grand passion of their secret affair was stripped away, leaving something quieter, deeper, and far more resilient. Love, they discovered, was not just stolen kisses in a moonlit garden. It was fetching water when the other was tired. It was sharing the last piece of bread. It was sitting in comfortable silence by a crackling fire as a storm raged outside. The gilded cage was gone, and in its place was a vast, terrifying, and exhilarating freedom. Without the constant performance demanded by society, their true selves emerged, no longer shadowed by duty or desperation. Alistair found he was not defined by his title. He discovered a love for working with his hands, a satisfaction in the tangible results of a well-mended fence or a productive garden. He wrote letters, not to ministers of state, but to the local newspaper, arguing passionately for the rights of the fishermen in the nearby village. He found a new purpose, smaller in scale, but infinitely more meaningful. Eleanor, free from the need to sell her art to survive, began to paint for herself. Her work became bolder, more honest. She painted the raw, dramatic landscapes of the coast, but she also painted Alistair, not as the world saw him, the disgraced lord, but as she did. A man of quiet strength and surprising tenderness, his face etched with the lines of a life he had not expected, but had finally chosen. Their future was fragile. They lived on a small annuity left to Alistair by his grandmother, their existence a constant struggle against the encroaching poverty they had never known. The shadow of their scandal still lingered. They were a cautionary tale, a story whispered in London to frighten rebellious sons and ambitious daughters. But here, on the edge of the world, it didn't matter. One crisp autumn afternoon, they walked along the cliffs, the sea, a churning expanse of gray and blue below them. They had been in Cornwall for nearly a year. "Do you ever regret it?" Eleanor asked, her voice soft, almost carried away by the wind. It was the question that had hung unspoken between them for months. Alistair stopped walking and turned to face her. He took her hands, his grip firm and warm. He looked at her, at the woman who had turned his world upside down, who had challenged everything he thought he knew about himself. He saw the woman who had stood by him, who had faced down earls and whispers, who had helped him build a new life from the ashes of the old. "My only regret," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide, "is that I spent so many years living a life that wasn't my own. You didn't ruin me, Eleanor. You saved me." It was the final, absolute truth. He had not been ruined. He had been redeemed. The scandal had not been his downfall. It had been his liberation. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple ring, one he had bought in the village, not with his family's fortune, but with the money from the sale of a small piece of furniture. It was not a diamond from Bond Street, but a simple band of silver, as honest and unadorned as their life together. "You once said I must marry you," he said, a gentle smile playing on his lips. "It seems I am a man of my word." He slipped the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. They were not a lord and an artist's daughter. They were not a scandal. They were two people who had found each other in the wreckage and had built a fragile, beautiful future, marked by both love and consequence, a testament to the defiant, enduring power of a touch on a darkened terrace.